There comes a moment in your life when you have to ask yourself a question that may completely change the way you see your relationships. What if the problem is not that you are too kind, but that you keep giving kindness to people who have learned that they can hurt you without consequences? What if you have spent years believing that being patient, understanding, forgiving, available, generous, and compassionate would eventually teach certain people how to value you, only to discover that some people were never confused about your value? They were simply comfortable benefiting from your willingness to keep giving. And this is where I want you to slow down, because this message is not about becoming bitter. It is not about becoming cruel. It is not about treating people badly because someone treated you badly. It is not about revenge, and it is not about learning how to manipulate a manipulator. It is about something much deeper. It is about learning the difference between kindness and self-abandonment. It is about understanding why some people become more entitled when you become more generous. It is about recognizing patterns that can occur in narcissistic or emotionally manipulative relationships. And most importantly, it is about remembering that compassion without boundaries can eventually become a prison. You may have been taught that a good person always forgives. Maybe you were taught that you should always give people another chance. Maybe you were told that walking away means you are selfish. Maybe you learned that keeping the peace is more important than expressing your pain. Maybe you became the person who says, "It's okay," even when it wasn't okay. You said, "I understand," even when nobody tried to understand you. You accepted apologies without changed behavior. You gave second chances, third chances, 10th chances. You kept explaining what hurt you. You kept hoping that if you could just communicate clearly enough, love deeply enough, forgive generously enough, or remain patient long enough, the other person would finally recognize what they were doing. But sometimes the lesson is not that you need to become better at explaining yourself. Sometimes the lesson is that you need to become better at listening to what someone's repeated behavior is telling you, because words can be beautiful. Promises can be beautiful. Apologies can be beautiful. Tears can be convincing. Stories can be emotional. But patterns tell you something that individual moments cannot. A person can say they love you and still repeatedly behave in ways that hurt you. A person can apologize and still repeat the same behavior. A person can tell you that they respect you while consistently violating your boundaries. A person can say they need you while treating your presence as an entitlement rather than a privilege. And when that happens, your job is not to become harsher. Your job is to become clearer. There are people in this world who may not respond to kindness with gratitude. Some may respond to kindness with entitlement. Some may interpret your flexibility as permission. Some may interpret your forgiveness as proof that there will never be consequences. Some may learn that every time they hurt you, you will eventually come back and restore the relationship. And in relationships where narcissistic traits or manipulative patterns are present, this dynamic can become particularly painful because the relationship may gradually become organized around one person's needs, emotions, image, and control. You begin adjusting yourself constantly. You think about their mood before you speak. You calculate whether something will upset them. You rehearse conversations in your head. You wonder whether you are being too sensitive. You apologize just to end the argument. You suppress your anger because you know what happens when you express it. You become hyper aware of their reactions while becoming increasingly disconnected from your own needs. And then one day, you realize something devastating. You have become an expert on their emotions and a stranger to your own. That realization can hurt deeply because you may remember the person you were before the relationship became complicated. You remember when you trusted your instincts. You remember when you could make decisions without worrying about someone else's reaction. You remember when saying no didn't fill you with guilt. You remember when your happiness didn't depend on whether someone approved of you. And now you are trying to find that person again. If that is where you are, listen carefully. You are not weak because you cared. You are not foolish because you believed someone. You are not stupid because you gave someone another chance. Your capacity to love is not the problem. Your empathy is not the enemy. Your tenderness is not something you need to be ashamed of. But your kindness needs protection. And one of the first things you need to stop doing is being endlessly nice to people who repeatedly disrespect you. Not because you need to punish them, but because you need to stop participating in your own exhaustion. Think about what happens when someone repeatedly crosses a boundary and you respond by becoming even more understanding. They may learn, consciously or unconsciously, that the boundary is not really a boundary. It is only a request that can be ignored. You say, "Please don't speak to me that way." They do it again. You say, "That really hurt me." They do it again. You say, "If this continues, I will leave the conversation." They continue. And then you stay and continue explaining. At some point, the conversation is no longer about whether they understand your boundary. It becomes about whether you are willing to enforce it. That distinction can change your life. A boundary is not simply something you announce. A boundary is what you decide you will do to protect yourself when a certain behavior occurs. You cannot control whether another person respects your boundary. You can control whether you remain available for the behavior. You cannot force someone to speak respectfully, but you can end the conversation when disrespect begins. You cannot force someone to be honest, but you can stop giving them access to information they repeatedly misuse. You cannot force someone to appreciate your generosity, but you can stop overgiving. You cannot force someone to stop manipulating you, but you can stop participating in endless arguments designed to pull you into confusion. You cannot make another person become emotionally healthy, but you can make decisions that protect your emotional health. And this is where real empowerment begins. It begins when you stop confusing control over another person with control over your own life. The first person you need to stop being endlessly nice to is the person who repeatedly disrespects your boundaries. Maybe they interrupt you. Maybe they insult you and call it humor. Maybe they pressure you after you have said no. Maybe they demand immediate access to you. Maybe they become angry when you have your own plans. Maybe they treat your privacy as something they are entitled to invade. Maybe they make decisions that affect you without consulting you. Maybe they constantly test how much you will tolerate. And every time you tolerate it, you may tell yourself, it's not worth the fight. But what if the fight is not the point? What if the point is that your life is being slowly shaped around avoiding conflict? You begin making yourself smaller because you want peace. But there is a difference between peace and the absence of conflict. Sometimes silence is peaceful. Sometimes silence is fear. Sometimes compromise is healthy. Sometimes compromise means one person is constantly surrendering. Sometimes forgiveness is healing. Sometimes forgiveness becomes a permission slip for continued mistreatment. You have to learn the difference. A healthy relationship can survive boundaries. In fact, healthy relationships often become stronger because boundaries create clarity. You can say no without being punished. You can disagree without being humiliated. You can have privacy without being accused of betrayal. You can spend time with other people without being treated as disloyal. You can have needs without being called needy. When a person consistently reacts to your reasonable boundaries with rage, guilt, threats, humiliation, silent treatment, retaliation, or manipulation, that reaction itself is information. It does not automatically prove that the person has narcissistic personality disorder. We should be careful with labels, but it can tell you something important about the relational pattern. It tells you that your autonomy may be uncomfortable for them, and that matters because you were not born to become someone else's emotional servant. You are allowed to have a life. You are allowed to say no. You are allowed to change your mind. You are allowed to need rest. You are allowed to have friends. You are allowed to have dreams. You are allowed to protect your privacy. You are allowed to disagree. You are allowed to leave conversations. You are allowed to decide what kind of behavior you will accept. And you do not need a courtroom verdict from another person before you are allowed to protect yourself. The second thing you need to stop doing is being endlessly nice to people who repeatedly invalidate your reality. This is where many emotionally difficult relationships become psychologically exhausting. You say, "That hurt me." They say, "You're too sensitive." You say, "I remember you said this." They say, "I never said that." You say, "This keeps happening." They say, "You're imagining things." You say, "I don't feel respected." They say, "You always make everything about yourself." And suddenly, you are no longer discussing their behavior. You are defending your right right to have feelings. This can become incredibly destabilizing. When your experiences are repeatedly dismissed, minimized, denied, or reframed, you may start questioning your own perceptions. This can overlap with what people commonly describe as gaslighting, although not every disagreement or memory conflict is gaslighting. Genuine gaslighting involves a pattern of manipulation that can cause someone to doubt their perceptions, memories, or judgment. And if you experience that repeatedly, you may begin looking outside yourself for permission to trust what you know. You start asking friends, "Do you think I'm overreacting?" You search online for explanations. You replay conversations. You screenshot messages. You reconstruct timelines. You analyze facial expressions. You remember exact words. You become your own private investigator because someone has made you feel like your reality is always on trial. But healing begins when you understand something powerful. You do not need to prove every detail to yourself forever. Your feelings are information. They are not always perfect evidence about another person's intentions, but they are information about your internal experience. If someone repeatedly leaves you anxious, confused, humiliated, afraid, or emotionally depleted, you can take that seriously. You don't need to convince the other person that you are hurt before you are allowed to respond to being hurt. Think about how much energy you have spent trying to make someone understand your pain. Maybe you have written long messages. Maybe you have explained the same issue in 5 different ways. Maybe you have used examples. Maybe you have begged them to understand. Maybe you have cried while explaining. Maybe you thought, if they could just see what this is doing to me, they would change. And sometimes people do change, but sometimes they understand perfectly well that you are hurt and simply do not prioritize changing their behavior. That possibility is painful, but it is also liberating because once you stop making their understanding the requirement for your healing, you become free to act. You can say, "I don't feel safe continuing this conversation." You can say, "I'm not willing to discuss this anymore." You can say, "If you speak to me that way, I will leave." You can say nothing at all, and then you can follow through. The third thing you need to stop doing is being endlessly nice to people who only value you when you are useful. This is one of the most painful patterns because it can disguise itself as closeness. They call you when they need something. They disappear when you need something. They celebrate you when your success benefits their image. They criticize you when your success threatens their sense of superiority. They want your attention, your money, your connections, your labor, your emotional support, your availability, your problem-solving skills. But when you need comfort, they are busy. When you need encouragement, they change the subject. When you have good news, they minimize it. When you are struggling, they may make your struggle about themselves. You begin realizing that the relationship has an invisible price tag. You are loved most when you are useful. And that can create a devastating emotional confusion because you may mistake being needed for being loved. But being needed and being loved are not the same thing. Someone can need what you provide without truly respecting who you are. Someone can depend on your labor without valuing your humanity. Someone can miss your availability without missing you. And once you understand that, you begin asking better questions. Do they care about me when I have nothing to give? Can I say no without losing the relationship? Can I be tired around them? Can I have needs? Can I succeed without being punished? Can I disappoint them without being discarded? Can I disagree without being attacked? Can I exist without constantly performing? Those questions reveal the quality of a relationship much more clearly than grand declarations of love. Because love that requires you to constantly perform is not freedom. And you were not created to audition for your place in someone's life. Maybe you became the fixer. You solved problems, you paid bills, you made excuses, you mediated conflicts, you comforted everyone. You carried emotional burdens that were not yours. You became the responsible one, and perhaps people praised you for being strong. But sometimes being called strong can become another way of saying you will tolerate more. So hear this clearly. You are allowed to stop being the person who rescues everyone. You are allowed to let adults experience the consequences of their choices. You are allowed to stop solving problems that people repeatedly create. You are allowed to stop volunteering for emotional labor that leaves you empty. You are allowed to say, I can't do that. And you do not have to follow that sentence with a 10-minute explanation. The fourth thing you need to stop doing is being endlessly nice to people who repeatedly manipulate your guilt. Guilt is powerful, especially if you are an empathetic person. A manipulative person may discover that they cannot control you through logic, so they attempt to control you through emotion. You've changed. You don't care about me anymore. After everything I've done for you, I guess I'm the bad person now. You're abandoning me. You're selfish. You think you're better than everyone. These statements may not always be consciously calculated, but in a manipulative relationship, they can function as emotional pressure. And if you have been trained to prioritize everyone else's feelings over your own, you may immediately start defending yourself. You explain. You reassure. You apologize. You soften the boundary. You give in. And then the cycle repeats. But guilt does not always mean you have done something wrong. Sometimes guilt simply means you have done something unfamiliar. You may feel guilty because you said no. You may feel guilty because you stopped rescuing someone. You may feel guilty because you chose yourself. You may feel guilty because you disappointed someone who was accustomed to your unlimited availability. That guilt does not necessarily mean you should reverse your decision. Sometimes guilt is the emotional withdrawal symptom of an old pattern. Your nervous system may be accustomed to keeping everyone happy. So when you finally stop, your mind screams, danger. But you need to learn to distinguish danger from discomfort. Setting a boundary may feel uncomfortable. Being disliked may feel uncomfortable. Walking away may feel uncomfortable. Not responding to a provocative message may feel uncomfortable. Allowing someone to misunderstand you may feel uncomfortable. But discomfort is not always a sign that you are doing something wrong. Sometimes discomfort is the price of changing. The fifth thing you need to stop doing is being endlessly nice to people who repeatedly punish you for being yourself. This may be the deepest one, because some relationships don't simply ask you to behave better. They ask you to become someone else. They want you quieter, less successful, less independent, less emotional, less confident, less social, less ambitious, less expressive, less opinionated, less alive. You start editing yourself. You stop talking about your dreams because they criticize them. You stop celebrating because they mock your excitement. You stop dressing the way you like because they make comments. You stop seeing certain friends because it causes conflict. You stop saying what you think because every disagreement becomes an argument. Eventually, you may become the version of yourself that causes the least disturbance. And then you wonder why you don't recognize yourself anymore. Listen to me. A relationship should not require you to disappear in order to survive. You can grow. You can change. You can compromise. You can learn. But you should not have to amputate your identity to keep another person comfortable. If someone only accepts you when you are convenient, agreeable, silent, or useful, the problem may not be that you are difficult to love. The problem may be that they are only comfortable with a version of you that they can control. And that is not love you need to chase. That is approval you need to stop depending upon. This is where emotional detachment becomes powerful. Emotional detachment does not mean that you stop caring about everyone. It means that you stop allowing another person's emotional state to dictate your entire internal world. If they are angry, you do not automatically panic. If they are disappointed, you do not automatically apologize. If they withdraw affection, you do not automatically chase. If they criticize you, you do not automatically question your worth. If they provoke you, you do not automatically respond. You begin creating a space between what they do and what you choose. That space is freedom. And sometimes that freedom requires distance. For some relationships, low contact may be appropriate. For others, no contact may be the safest and healthiest option, especially when the relationship is abusive and there is no constructive pathway to change. But no contact should not be viewed as a magic trick designed to make another person suffer, chase you, or suddenly recognize your value. That keeps your attention psychologically tied to them. The purpose of distance is not to make them obsessed with you. The purpose is to make you available to yourself again. That is the difference. If you go no contact while constantly checking whether they have contacted you, monitoring their social media, wondering whether they miss you, imagining their reaction, and waiting for them to regret losing you, your body may be physically distant while your mind remains emotionally attached. Real detachment is different. Real detachment says, I don't need to know what they are thinking today. I don't need to know whether they regret it. I don't need to know whether they are talking about me. I don't need to know whether they have found someone else. I don't need to know whether they finally understand. I need to know what I am doing with my life. That is where your power comes back. Because one of the cruelest consequences of toxic relationships is that they consume your attention. You wake up thinking about them. You work thinking about them. You eat thinking about them. You sleep thinking about them. You replay conversations. You imagine future conversations. You wonder what you should have said. You wonder what you should say next. You wonder whether you were too harsh. You wonder whether you should apologize. You wonder whether they are changing. And slowly, your entire mental world becomes organized around one person. Healing means rebuilding a world that does not revolve around them. You have to reclaim your attention. Start with small things. What do you want to listen to? What do you want to eat? Who do you want to talk to? Where do you want to go? What do you want to learn? What do you want to build? What kind of person do you want to become? These questions may sound simple, but after prolonged emotional manipulation, simple questions can feel revolutionary. Because you may have spent so long asking, what will they think, that you forgot to ask, what do I think? You may have spent so long asking, will they be angry, that you forgot to ask, what do I need? You may have spent so long asking, how do I keep this relationship, that you forgot to ask, is this relationship healthy for me? And now it is time to ask, not with hatred, not with revenge, with honesty, because clarity is kinder than confusion. You don't need to hate someone to leave them. You don't need to prove they are evil. You don't need to diagnose them. You don't need to convince everyone around you. You don't need to build a case for your own freedom. Sometimes you simply recognize that a relationship is harming you and decide that your life needs to move in another direction. That is enough. And if you have been conditioned to be overly accommodating, you may initially feel like boundaries make you a bad person. You may feel selfish. You may feel cold. You may feel guilty. You may even hear the voice of the person who criticized you saying, "See, you really are selfish." But remember this. Selfishness and self-respect are not the same thing. Selfishness says, only my needs matter. Self-respect says, my needs matter too. Selfishness ignores the humanity of others. Self-respect refuses to erase your own humanity. There is room for compassion and boundaries. There is room for forgiveness and distance. There is room for understanding someone's childhood while refusing to let their childhood become your lifelong punishment. Maybe they were hurt. Maybe they were neglected. Maybe they experienced trauma. Maybe they learned unhealthy ways of relating. Maybe they genuinely struggle with emotional regulation. Those things may explain behavior. They do not automatically excuse behavior. Understanding the wound does not require volunteering to become the target. You can have compassion for someone's pain from a distance. You can wish someone healing without allowing them access to you. You can forgive someone without reconciling. You can release resentment without reopening the door. And this is one of the most mature forms of healing, learning that compassion does not require proximity. You can stop being nice in the way that destroys you while remaining kind in the way that preserves your humanity. Maybe your kindness now looks like silence. Maybe it looks like leaving. Maybe it looks like refusing to participate in an argument. Maybe it looks like not explaining yourself anymore. Maybe it looks like returning someone's belongings without a dramatic conversation. Maybe it looks like communicating only about necessary matters. Maybe it looks like saying, "I'm not available for this." Maybe it looks like blocking a number. Maybe it looks like getting professional support. Maybe it looks like rebuilding friendships you neglected. Maybe it looks like sleeping peacefully for the first time in months. Healing doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes healing is incredibly quiet. It is the first morning you wake up and don't immediately check your phone. It is the first time you hear their name and your stomach doesn't drop. It is the first time you remember something painful without feeling the need to explain it. It is the first time you realize you no longer need their apology. It is the first time you understand that closure does not have to come from the person who wounded you, and that realization can be profound. Because many people stay emotionally trapped, waiting for a conversation that may never happen. They imagine the perfect apology. They imagine the person finally admitting everything. "I was wrong. I hurt you. I manipulated you. I didn't appreciate you. I understand now." Maybe you will receive that apology. Maybe you won't. But your healing cannot be held hostage by another person's capacity for accountability. Some people may never give you the closure you deserve, so you may have to give yourself closure. Closure can be the sentence, "I know enough. I know how I felt. I know what happened. I know what pattern I experienced. I know what I will no longer tolerate. I know what I need now. And I am moving forward." That is closure. Not because every question has been answered, but because you have stopped requiring every question to be answered before you permit yourself to live. You may never know why they did everything they did. You may never understand why someone could say they loved you and still hurt you. You may never understand why they apologized and repeated it. You may never understand why they seemed so loving at the beginning and so different later. You may never understand why they treated someone else differently. But your healing does not require a perfect psychological explanation for every painful event. Sometimes the answer is simply that the relationship was unhealthy, and that is enough. You need to stop measuring your worth by how someone treated you. A person's inability to love you well is not proof that you were unlovable. Someone's rejection is not a psychological evaluation. Someone's criticism is not an objective description of you. Someone's jealousy is not evidence that you are arrogant. Someone's emotional withdrawal is not proof that you are worthless. Someone's manipulation is not evidence that you are stupid. In fact, people who are deeply empathetic can sometimes be especially vulnerable to manipulation because they are willing to consider the other person's perspective. They ask, what if they're hurting? What if I misunderstood? What if I should be more patient? What if I am being unfair? Those questions can reflect emotional maturity. But emotional maturity also requires another question. What if I am being unfair to myself? That question can be the beginning of a new life, because you can become so committed to seeing everyone's perspective that you forget to include yourself in the picture. You understand their childhood. You understand their stress. You understand their fears. You understand their insecurity. You understand their trauma. But who understands you? You do. And it is time to start standing beside yourself. That does not mean you become your own victim forever. It means you stop abandoning yourself in order to maintain relationships that require your silence. There is a difference between self-reflection and self-blame. Self-reflection asks, what can I learn? Self-blame asks, how is everything my fault? Self-reflection creates growth. Self-blame creates shame. You can acknowledge mistakes you made without accepting responsibility for someone else's mistreatment. Maybe you stayed too long. Learn from it. Maybe you ignored red flags. Learn from it. Maybe you overgave. Learn from it. Maybe you tolerated behavior you should have challenged earlier. Learn from it. But do not turn your past survival strategy into a lifelong identity. You did what you knew how to do with what you understood at the time. Now you know more. Now you see more. Now you can choose differently. And that is what healing is, not rewriting the past. Changing what the past gets to determine about your future. You may have once believed that being a good person meant always being available. Now you understand that availability is a choice. You may have believed that forgiveness meant continued access. Now you understand that forgiveness and access are separate. You may have believed that love meant enduring everything. Now you understand that healthy love includes mutual respect. You may have believed that patience meant waiting indefinitely for someone to change. Now you understand that patience without limits can become self-neglect. You may have believed that being understanding meant accepting every explanation. Now you understand that explanations do not replace accountability, and you may have believed that walking away meant failure. Now you understand that sometimes walking away is the first evidence that you finally chose yourself. There will be people who do not like the new you. Let them. There will be people who say, you have changed. You have. There will be people who call your boundaries selfish. They may be accustomed to the version of you who had none. There will be people who say, You used to be so nice. And you can silently answer, I am still kind. I am simply no longer available for mistreatment. That is not cruelty. That is growth. You do not owe everyone the same version of you. Your generosity should not be an unlimited resource. Your time should not be an unlimited resource. Your emotional energy should not be an unlimited resource. Your attention should not be an unlimited resource. Your forgiveness should not be an unlimited resource. And your access should certainly not be an unlimited resource. Access to you is something people earn through trust, respect, consistency, and accountability. You don't have to hand everyone the keys to your emotional life simply because they ask. And if someone repeatedly demonstrates that they misuse access to you, reducing access is not punishment. It is information. It is protection. It is wisdom. This is why you need to stop obsessing over whether someone is a narcissist. Sometimes the label can help you understand patterns, but the label should not become the center of your healing. The more important question is not, are they officially a narcissist? The more important question is, what happens to me in this relationship? Do I feel respected? Do I feel safe expressing disagreement? Can I say no? Can I have boundaries? Do they take responsibility? Do they repair harm? Can they tolerate my autonomy? Do I feel like myself? Do I spend most of my time anxious? Am I constantly defending my reality? Do I feel emotionally exhausted? Do I feel afraid of their reaction? Am I always the one apologizing? Am I losing confidence? Am I becoming isolated? Those questions matter because sometimes we become so focused on identifying the other person that we forget to evaluate our own experience. You don't need a diagnosis to know that something is unhealthy for you. You don't need a psychological label to justify a boundary. You don't need permission to protect your peace. And perhaps the most important lesson of all is this: stop trying to convince people to value you. People who genuinely value you may still make mistakes. They may disappoint you. They may have blind spots. Healthy relationships are not perfect relationships. But there is a willingness to repair. There is curiosity. There is accountability. There is respect. There is room for your humanity. If you constantly have to prove why you deserve basic consideration, something is wrong. If you constantly have to earn the right to have feelings, something is wrong. If your needs are treated as inconveniences, while their needs are treated as emergencies, something is wrong. And you don't have to stay in that dynamic simply because there were good moments. Good moments do not erase harmful patterns. A relationship can contain beautiful memories and still be unhealthy. Someone can have good qualities and still be harmful to you. You can love someone and still leave. You can miss someone and still leave. You can understand someone and still leave. You can forgive someone and still leave. You can wish them well and still choose yourself. This is where mature self-respect begins. Not in hatred, in acceptance. Acceptance that you cannot make another person become who you need them to be. Acceptance that love does not guarantee compatibility. Acceptance that potential is not the same as reality. Acceptance that apologies without sustained change may not be enough. Acceptance that your future cannot be built around waiting for someone else's transformation. And when you accept that, something begins to loosen inside you. The endless struggle starts to fade. You stop arguing with reality. You stop trying to turn a closed door into an open one. You stop chasing explanations. You stop negotiating with behavior that has already shown you what it is, and you begin walking, one step at a time, toward yourself. Maybe you need to rebuild your confidence. Start small. Keep promises to yourself. If you say you're going to sleep at a certain time, do it. If you say you're going to stop checking their social media, practice stopping. If you say you're going to take a walk, take the walk. If you say you will not answer disrespectful messages immediately, give yourself time. Self-trust is rebuilt through small acts of self-consistency. You spent so long trusting someone else that perhaps you forgot how to trust yourself. So start keeping your own promises. You don't need a dramatic transformation overnight. You need repetition. You need consistency. You need patience. And eventually, something beautiful happens. You begin believing yourself again. You begin hearing your own intuition. You begin recognizing your limits before you reach exhaustion. You begin noticing discomfort earlier. You begin saying no sooner. You stop waiting until you are furious before admitting that something is wrong. You stop allowing resentment to become the only evidence that you have a boundary. And that is a major transformation, because resentment often grows where boundaries are missing. You keep saying yes when you mean no. You keep giving when you feel depleted. You keep listening when you need rest. You keep forgiving when you need distance. You keep accepting when you need to speak. And eventually your kindness becomes resentment. The solution is not to become cruel. The solution is to become honest earlier. Say no before you become angry. Speak before you explode. Leave before you become consumed. Protect yourself before you become bitter. That is emotional maturity. And if you are dealing with someone who becomes more manipulative when you establish boundaries, remember this: you do not have to make the boundary emotionally comfortable for them. A boundary may disappoint them. Let it. A boundary may frustrate them. Let it. A boundary may expose an unhealthy dynamic. Let it. Your job is not to make your boundary painless for someone else. Your job is to communicate it clearly and follow through safely. And if you are in a relationship involving intimidation, threats, stalking, violence, coercion, or other forms of abuse, prioritize safety and consider reaching out to appropriate professional or local support rather than attempting dramatic confrontation. You don't prove strength by putting yourself in danger. Strength can look like planning. Strength can look like asking for help. Strength can look like documenting important information when appropriate. Strength can look like creating financial independence. Strength can look like finding safe housing. Strength can look like speaking with a qualified professional. Strength can look like quietly preparing for a safer future. There is no prize for suffering longer than necessary. And please hear that again. There is no prize for suffering longer than necessary. You don't get extra points for enduring what is destroying you. You don't become more moral because you stayed until you disappeared. Your ability to tolerate pain is not the measurement of your character. Your ability to recognize pain and respond wisely is. So stop being nice in the way that requires you to betray yourself. Be kind, but be discerning. Be compassionate, but have boundaries. Be forgiving, but remember patterns. Be generous, but do not give from an empty soul. Be understanding, but include yourself in your understanding. Love others, but do not make yourself the price of that love. And when you encounter someone who repeatedly does these 5 things, disrespects your boundaries, invalidates your reality, uses you primarily when you are useful, manipulates your guilt, and punishes you for being authentically yourself. You don't have to become their enemy. You simply have to stop volunteering for the role they have assigned you. You are not their emotional punching bag. You are not their therapist. You are not their rescuer. You are not their supply of endless validation. You are not responsible for regulating every emotion they experience. You are not responsible for protecting them from every consequence. You are not responsible for making them comfortable with your autonomy. You are responsible for your choices, your boundaries, your healing, your future, your life. And perhaps the most beautiful thing you will discover is that when you stop spending all your energy trying to manage someone else's behavior, you finally have energy to build your own life. You can read again. You can exercise again. You can create again. You can laugh again. You can reconnect with people. You can pursue goals. You can sleep without waiting for the next argument. You can sit in silence without fear. You can make plans without calculating someone else's reaction. You can become curious about yourself again. And one day, you may look back and realize that the person you were trying so desperately to get someone else to love was already worthy of love. You just weren't loving yourself enough to protect that person. And that realization does not need to become another reason to shame yourself. Let it become a reason to change. You don't have to hate the old version of yourself. That version survived. That version hoped. That version loved. That version tried. That version did not know what you know now. Thank that version. And then let it rest. Because you are allowed to become wiser without becoming harder, you are allowed to become stronger without becoming colder. You are allowed to become more discerning without losing compassion. You are allowed to become more protective of yourself without becoming selfish. You are allowed to close doors without becoming bitter. You are allowed to walk away without wishing someone harm. You are allowed to choose peace. And if today you are standing at that crossroads, wondering whether you should keep explaining, keep forgiving, keep waiting, keep hoping, keep trying to make someone finally see your value, I want you to remember this. You do not have to convince someone of your worth in order to possess it. Your worth existed before they met you. Your worth existed during the relationship. Your worth exists after the relationship. Their inability to recognize it never had the power to remove it. So stop begging for basic respect. Stop negotiating against your own needs. Stop calling self-abandonment kindness. Stop calling fear patience. Stop calling exhaustion love. Stop calling endless tolerance forgiveness. Stop calling emotional confusion connection and start calling things what they are. A boundary is a boundary. A repeated pattern is a repeated pattern. Disrespect is disrespect. Manipulation is manipulation. Exhaustion is information. Fear is information. Resentment is information. Your loss of yourself is information. And when the information becomes clear, you have a choice. You can keep repeating the pattern, or you can choose yourself. Choosing yourself does not mean you stop loving people. It means you finally understand that love without self-respect is not sustainable. You can love someone and still say no. You can care about someone and still create distance. You can forgive someone and still refuse access. You can understand someone and still hold them accountable. You can wish them healing and still heal somewhere else. That is not hatred. That is freedom. And perhaps your next chapter will not begin with a dramatic confrontation. Perhaps it will begin quietly, with one no, one boundary, one unanswered provocation, one decision not to explain yourself, one appointment with a therapist, one conversation with a trusted friend, one morning without checking their profile, one evening spent doing something you love, one promise kept to yourself, one moment when you realize, I don't have to go back, and then another, and another, until eventually you realize that your life has become bigger than the person who once occupied so much of your mind. That is healing. Healing is not forgetting. Healing is remembering without being controlled by the memory. Healing is not becoming indifferent to everything. Healing is caring without abandoning yourself. Healing is not winning against the person who hurt you. Healing is no longer needing to win. Healing is no longer asking whether they regret losing you. Healing is asking whether you are proud of the person you are becoming. And I want you to become someone who trusts themselves, someone who notices patterns, someone who speaks clearly, someone who respects their own limits, someone who does not confuse chemistry with compatibility, someone who does not mistake intensity for intimacy, someone who does not mistake being needed for being loved, someone who does not chase people who repeatedly withdraw, someone who does not beg for basic respect, someone who understands that healthy relationships do not require the disappearance of the self. That person is still inside you. You don't need to create them from nothing. You need to stop silencing them. So the next time someone tells you that you have changed because you finally established a boundary, remember, perhaps you have changed. Perhaps you finally stopped abandoning yourself. The next time someone calls you selfish because you said no, remember, having needs does not make you selfish. The next time someone tells you that you're too sensitive, remember, sensitivity is not the same as weakness. The next time someone says, you're overreacting, pause and ask yourself what pattern you have been experiencing. The next time you feel guilty for protecting your peace, ask yourself whether the guilt belongs to you or whether you were trained to carry someone else's discomfort. And the next time you are tempted to return simply because you miss someone, remember that missing a person is not the same as being safe with them. You can miss someone and still know that the relationship was unhealthy. You can remember the good and still acknowledge the bad. You can grieve what you hoped it would become while accepting what it actually was. That is grief. And grief is not a sign that you made the wrong decision. Sometimes grief is simply the price of accepting reality. You are grieving the relationship. You may also be grieving the future you imagined, the apology you wanted, the version of them you hoped would return, the version of yourself you lost. Give yourself permission to grieve all of it. But do not confuse grief with a command to go back. Sometimes grief walks beside you as you move forward. Let it. You don't have to rush healing. You don't have to pretend you don't care. You don't have to become emotionally numb. You simply have to keep choosing what is healthy, again and again. And one day, the kindness you once gave away so freely will begin coming home to you. You will speak to yourself differently. You will stop insulting yourself for staying. You will stop replaying every mistake. You will stop asking why you weren't enough. You will start saying, I deserved better. Not because you were perfect, not because the other person was necessarily all bad, but because basic respect should never have been something you had to earn through suffering. You deserved relationships where you could breathe, where you could speak, where you could disagree, where you could rest, where you could grow, where your success was celebrated, where your boundaries were respected, where your vulnerability was safe, where your presence was valued for more than what you could provide. And if you haven't experienced that yet, do not assume it does not exist. Let the unhealthy relationship teach you what you will no longer accept, not what you should expect from everyone. Do not let one person's behavior convince you that everyone is dangerous. Do not let one person's manipulation convince you that intimacy is impossible. Do not let one person's cruelty convince you that your softness was a mistake. Your softness was never the mistake. The mistake was giving unlimited access to people who did not handle that softness responsibly. Now you know. And knowledge changes everything.